So the first talk is going to be Akshay, who is co-founder at Pulse and now at LinkedIn, to talk about product teams.
Thanks, Parker. How's everybody doing? Good. Awesome. So I'm Akshay Kothari. I'm one of the co-founders of Pulse. Pulse was actually started as a class project at Stanford, and we had an amazing journey for about 2.5 years before we were acquired by LinkedIn about 4 months ago. And my boss was actually supposed to be here, but he couldn't be here, so I'm actually representing unSEXY LinkedIn on stage today, which is really exciting. But I really wanted to talk about, I think in Pulse we grew from about 2 founders, to about 26 people. And one of the things that was really unique about Pulse that we tried to do, especially going back to our roots at the design school at Stanford, was to have every single person in the company really involved in actually product design. So we didn't have like one person who was really kind of driving the product design strategy. It was essentially everybody kind of coming together, having a lot of ideas, and I think like us founders were acting more of a more like editors to kind of figure out what's the next thing, and it grew really fast in the 2+ years we were there. And so I wanted to kind of talk about 2 things that kind of evolved pretty much every month, every few weeks, and that was kind of the organization structure in the company and kind of the communication between different team members. And when I talk about organization structure, it's mostly about the flow of information that was going through the company, rather than kind of this hierarchical structure of reporting and managers or anything like that. So we'll start with organization. When we started, it was just 2 of us. So it was actually pretty easy. We were in class. My co-founder, Ankit, was doing the iOS development, and I was kind of doing the design side and maybe a little bit of kind of business development. And we put this app out there in about 6 weeks of development, and it kind of took off. And we decided to kind of spend the summer building it, and then so on, kind of kept going at it. But during the summer, we added, a couple more people, and we added a person who was doing Android development, and then we added a person to actually have servers, because, the first version of Pulse did not have any backend server. It was just kind of the client actually talking to the internets and actually grabbing the content and actually displaying it in there. And so this is when we were actually still in kind of like in cafes, working out of cafes, and actually in an incubator. And it was actually fairly simple. I think we were just kind of, any person who had an idea or had questions about a particular release, we would just stand up, talk about it, and it didn't really require any way to kind of sync up about certain things that were going on. And we were really actually thinking not too far distant. It was just thinking about what's launching this week, what's launching next week. And then we moved to our first own space, when we now had a couple people doing iOS, a couple people doing Android, and also a couple people doing backend. And then by this time, we actually had a few products in the market. We had the iPad app, we had the iPhone app, we had the Android phone app, and the Android tablet app. And suddenly there was a sense of like these different products actually being a few features apart. Like there was something actually happening on iPad that was not supported on iPhone. Some things that were already in Android tablets that were not on the Android phone. And so I actually became the product manager for during this time, and my co-founder became kind of the head of iOS development. And I think like kind of I worked with a designer to actually come up with what are we going to launch the next month. Again, not very far in the future, but just the next month was enough. And we kind of created the specs that kind of each of the client teams followed. And it took us about 6 months, or 3 to 6 months, to get to a point where all the products were on the same feature set, so that when we're actually talking to the press about what we're launching, it was actually pretty coherent. Then we grew a little bit more, where we actually added the web team, which were actually building the web product. And suddenly we had these 4 or 5 different products that were all being built, supported by the backend team. And this is where we started to feel kind of a little bit of pain, where I suddenly started feeling, I was kind of the bottleneck for a lot of, design questions that people may have, or, if there's certain things that are not possible in Android, but that's possible in iOS. We got to a point where we suddenly felt like some of these ideas were not being heard, and this kind of got a little more complicated when we added, a couple more people on the back-end team, and then we had about a 3-person team really focused on actually bringing content for the Pulse app. And this is where actually, we kind of got together and really spent a couple of weeks figuring out, what is the right structure for this. And what we decided was we actually removed this kind of PM per se, and it kind of became each sub-team was kind of running with their own, the iOS team was kind of running with their own, they had a idea of what are the big things that we need to accomplish in the next month, 2 months. But I think they could still move a little bit away because there were certain iOS elements that they could run with because they could do it on their platform. Or for example, the Android team realized that there are widgets that we could build on top of what we're building already that they could kind of run ahead with and actually keep building. And this was actually a really good thing where the design team and my co-founder actually got together and kind of came up with hey, here's the next 6 weeks, here's something we're hoping to launch. But it allowed each team, each person to actually move slightly away and actually build products or build features that were actually pretty amazing, that we would not have been able to actually think from one kind of product manager thinking about 5 different platforms. And we were slightly wary of actually having managers for each of these platforms because we felt like engineers were actually doing a pretty amazing job actually managing that platform. And so this actually worked for a long time for us where these teams kind of ran with the features and we were always in sync with the high level, here's what we're launching, but they were able to actually navigate and actually build some of the things that they were passionate about. And the engineers, even the third Android engineer was excited and felt empowered that they can actually build features and launch that. And then when we were acquired, we had a similar structure. This seems a little more complicated than it is, but it was a similar structure where one of my co-founder was actually responsible for all the kind of core products that were happening, and he kind of set the tone with the design team. But I think that each individual team kind of went ahead and built products and made sure that we were hitting deadlines. By this time, we had also had about a 3-person sales team, which was actually responsible for pushing advertising. And this was actually 2 people sitting in New York and 1 person actually sitting out here. And so they were doing that. And then we had about a 4-person content team who was really focused on really getting content onto the platform. And so the overall team structure kind of basically revolved around these 3 teams having their own goals about the core product moving forward. As part of the product moving forward, new content that's coming to the platform, and sales, which is basically kickstarting advertising, which was very new for us. And then my role at this time was kind of split between spending some time with the core product stuff, but also spending a lot of time in terms of hiring, in terms of marketing, and actually kind of overseeing a little bit of kind of what's happening with the content acquisition and sales. And this is actually, this was the kind of the layout before LinkedIn acquired us. We're about 35 people now, but within a bigger organization, this is a lot more structured because there's an engineering team and then there's a marketing team, and it feels very different from a startup. But I think the left side of this slide is still very very consistent now, where we get together, kind of come up with the theme, and the product teams kind of go ahead and build that. But here's some of the lessons I learned, and we made a ton of mistakes actually getting to this point. But actually, one of the things we realized was every time we hired 1 or 2 people in the company, it suddenly felt like the flow of information kind of broke down. It felt like some people didn't know what was going on, or some people felt like the existing structure was not working, and it just required a little bit of a tweak to the existing process. But the tweak actually helped us be a lot more efficient with our kind of new structure, with new people joining on board. The other thing we realized was, especially the time when we actually had 1 product manager and we had 5 teams kind of building products, it felt like we were actually getting bottlenecked a fair bit. And so we actually really, over the last year of the company, we really pushed the power to the edges, where I think we were letting developers actually thinking about features, thinking about ideas, building them. And there was very little kind of, nobody was stopping them to think about those ideas and actually building them. I think people kind of built it, showed it to the whole company, and the company actually got to quickly decide whether this kind of made it into the Android release or the iPad release. And it allowed us to move really fast, where we were actually shipping a couple features every 6 weeks. And it was really, really a fun time for the company to move really fast and actually grow really fast. In 2011, we grew from about 1 million users to 11 million users. And then in 2012, we grew from 11 to almost 30 million users. And a lot of that was because we didn't actually have a marketing team really thinking about that. It was just product-led marketing. We were building all these new features, and we were actually being able to push that to our users who were kind of engaging with the app. And the last thing was actually really being very transparent about these structures. It's not about actually these structures are not kind of like you're reporting to these managers or here's the hierarchical structure of the company. It was mostly about in a flow of information within the team. So like if an Android engineer needs to know what needs to be done so that this actually makes it to the next release, he has a pretty clear understanding of what needs to happen. And actually this was something that we learned. The first year and a half we didn't do a particularly great job at, but I think in the next year it was actually pretty simple because people knew exactly what needs to happen before this feature gets shipped. Similar to this, the other side of the equation kind of was actually communication. And this was actually making sure that people know what people are actually working on. And we actually started a very simple way where actually we just had a list of people on a kind of like a foam board, and under the name of under each name of the people who are actually in the company, we would basically list out what are the tasks they're working on this week. And this actually scaled up really well for us from actually having doing it maybe when we were 3-4 people to almost when we were about 10-12 people. So basically had what you're working on right now. We had before that what are some of the things we need to work on, kind of like a backlog of tasks. And then we had a section which was what are some of the tasks that are done. And we kind of kept it there because moving your task to actually being done felt really good. And we actually had a stack, let it grow before we actually took it over and actually put it into the bin. And then we moved this to kind of a more of a digital task where we used Trello and a bunch of actually different kind of tools online where we had a very similar structure. It was just these sticky notes where you were able to kind of say, what are some of the tasks you're working on. It was very lightweight. It was very, very simple for anybody in the team to actually know what people are actually working on. When we got to about 20 people, this kind of felt a little like overwhelming where there were too many tasks. Maybe some of the tasks were actually falling down, and we had little less coherence in terms of what we're launching. And we moved to this simple structure where every Monday morning we would talk about what's the next 2 weeks sprint. And so every quarter we would come up with like here's what we're trying to accomplish in this quarter, and then we would actually break it down into 2-week sprints that we were doing. And this was the only all-hands meeting we had in terms of actually discussing tasks. And then the different sub-teams could actually go ahead and actually figure out whatever tools that they liked. But I think a simple plan where in this plan, the core team talked about what are the products that we're launching. Second, the content team talked about what are the new content that's coming up and where they need some resources. And the third thing was, the sales team talking about, how are they doing and what are some of the help they need from the different other teams. Outside of this communication, which was mostly about, what are the different products we're launching, and everybody staying in sync with that. The other thing we did was every Friday evening, we had this session which was basically kind of this open session where we all got together Friday evening, and everybody was allowed to speak out whatever was on their mind, except that we allowed people to only speak out using kind of like these three, they have to start the sentence either with I like something that happened this week, I wish something had happened this week, or if you have a question, I wonder, what's happening with this. And we did this every Friday evening for about 15 minutes, and it was amazing to see, just like simple questions that were on people's heads. So this was, I was taking notes on this day, and you can see like the conversation could be pretty broad. There were, people talked about, I like that we have a new timeline and product roadmap, to people talking about, I wish people drew more things in the bathroom rather than writing things, to like, I wish the women's bathroom had chalk paint, to like people actually talking really important things that were not being able to share. Like, I like that the Jenkins is actually catching bugs, but I wish it was actually better documented. I wish it was shared with other platforms. And the point of this was actually to just create a simple platform, by the end of the week, having this simple platform for people to actually give each other feedback. And it could be as simple as, I wish the Android team moved faster so that we actually launch this product. Or it could be a very simple thing about a person that was actually discussed. I wish, this person cleaned up after he used the kitchen. And, what actually helped a lot with this was we actually allowed people to actually, the little frustrations that people have was actually communicated very simply in this Friday session, which allowed people to actually not kind of have this frustration inside them and really kind of blast out. And this actually worked really well. It's something that we actually do internally even today as part of LinkedIn, and we're trying to get more people inside LinkedIn to actually participate in this. But it's something that I'd recommend doing, just giving people a platform to actually give feedback to a particular person, to a particular team, to the entire company. And there were some important questions that would come up to the founders as well, where somebody would talk about, I remember when there was the acquisition kind of rumor that actually went out in the press a couple of months ago. People could ask here, I wonder if LinkedIn is actually acquiring Pulse. And founders had to answer those and be very transparent about, what was actually going on. So the 3 lessons I kind of learned from the communication, over the last 3 years of actually running with Pulse is, a lot of people talk about, there should be no process, like processes, is what people kind of in big companies do. But I think like there, as you grow, like you do need some process. Otherwise, it kind of feels a little half-assert. There's less structure in terms of how you're building products. And so you kind of need a minimum viable process that allows you to actually, move really fast and with a lot of clarity. The other thing that I realized the hard way was actually, and this is actually a quote from a journal which says, good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. And this actually became more apparent to me when actually the team grew. When we were about 15, 20 people, suddenly, when you're a small team, you can actually, few people can actually handle ambiguity in terms of where the product is moving. When you're about, when we got to about 20, 25, or I'm sure like people who have organizations of hundreds of people, ambiguity kind of hurts the team morale a little bit in terms of, people not knowing where the company's actually going or where the product's going. And so I realized that, a good plan actually communicated really well that people can actually rally towards is actually better than actually waiting for people to be, very ambiguous about where it's going and waiting for this perfect plan that you can unveil, a few weeks from now. People are actually okay if the plan changes a little bit, as long as as long as there's good reasons for that. And then the last thing that, I think I've learned is this, having this, 15 minutes or whatever, take 10 minutes or whatever amount of time you can actually devote for actually decompressing a little bit every week. It allows, it helped us a lot in terms of, not having too many issues in the office in terms of people not getting along with each other, where every Friday, just this kind of little bit of pressure was kind of released, and people felt really good about, working at Pulse. So these are some of the things that I learned over the last, couple of years, kind of growing the Pulse team from about 2 people to about 26 people. Happy to take a few questions. I think we have 3 minutes. Any questions? All right. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
So first of all, I really like what you guys implemented. I like I wish, I wonder. How much would you guys get into tangents? Like after every I wish or I wonder, would you go really in depth into every I wonder, or was it more about just decompressing and letting it out?
Great question. So questions like, when we were doing I like, I wish, how much of a tangent were we allowed? So we actually iterated it. So initially we only had I like, I wish. And that went, and in that we basically had a rule where you cannot interject with anything. So it was just like people just 15 minutes of kind of like, it's almost like meditative. People were just talking about, the things they liked, things we wished. But we soon realized that people actually had questions and they were kind of using, I wish, in a way to actually, so we introduced I wonder, and then, and that actually worked really well. And then we iterated one more time where we actually allowed people who have answers to those questions to interject for 30 seconds. But we tried to kind of avoid long, drawn-out conversations in this, because it was really a time for people to actually like talk out, and speak whatever's on their mind. And I, as a founder, I actually, really picked people to make sure everybody's speaking, because a lot of times actually people were quiet, but actually like, I would actually point like a particular person, speak on what's in your mind, and actually it turns out that he had something that was bothering him or her. And so I think you can actually tweak it to how it works for your organization. The way we did it was kind of 15 minutes, just people letting it all out at the end of the week. So I think we're out of time, but I'm around, so feel free to ask me questions. Thank you.
Thank you.